Welcome. I am Renee Fry-McKibben, Professor of Economics at the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University and co-director of the COVID-19 and the Macroeconomy Research Program at CAMA, which is a Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis. We're excited to have you join us for the launch of our new program, COVID-19 and the Macroeconomy, with a panel discussion on new scenarios and longer-term issues for the world economy. But let me first begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose many traditional lands we meet through Zoom tonight and pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging. CAMA was established in 2003 to bring together economists across the globe working on applied macroeconomic and financial market issues. CAMA has almost 300 research associates from universities, central banks, international organisations and think tanks who belong to one of 12 research programs on themes in macroeconomics. The 2020 outbreak of COVID-19 is a truly global shock, unlike any seen before. The unfolding of COVID-19 is greatly uncertain. Health and hence economic outcomes appear to be vastly different across countries and even within states within countries. What is certain is that the global economy has fundamentally changed. The research program, COVID-19 and the Macroeconomy, jointly directed with Joaquim Vespignani, who is one of our panelists tonight, aims to understand the global and country-specific financial market and macroeconomic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. The program will provide a forum to explore the new financial market and economic linkages between countries and the potential mechanisms of recovery from the crisis. Already we have 47 research associates from 20 countries in the program, and many who have joined the launch tonight. To launch our program, I would like to introduce Dr. Jenny Gordon. Jenny is the Chief Economist at the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade in Australia. She was previously Principal Advisor Research at the Productivity Commission and is a longtime friend of CAMA. So, Jenny.
Hopefully this is working. Thank you. This is a real honour to be asked to launch this initiative because it really is, and of course my phone goes on just as that happens, doesn't it? Sorry about that. Because it's incredibly important. I had a slide, but unfortunately I couldn't get on my main computer, so I'm on my Mac and I don't have my slides. But what it was it showed.
I can put the slide up. I have a copy if you would like.
That would be brilliant, because what it shows is just the challenge we have for macro policy in these times, and we were already in a challenging time for macroeconomic policy. And what the slide shows, if Renee can kindly put it up and share it, it's just the US unemployment rate, but it has on it the sort of labels of how macroeconomic policy kind of responded at the various points in time. And it's really quite interesting how, economists got it so wrong or central banks got it so wrong, and often tightened monetary policy at the wrong point of time, making recessions worse than they would have been, which is the peaks in unemployment you see up until the sort of the early 1970s. And then we sort of shifted in the crises that we faced, but also understanding of how better to manage monetary policy to smooth some of the unemployment shocks. So we had more real shocks to the economy. And now if you look at towards the end of the slide, which in mine is covered with the very nice faces of the people on the call on the right hand side, but you'll see that unemployment going through the roof and COVID-19 just raises whole new questions about how we think about macroeconomic policy. We're sitting at a time when we know that government debt will be at unprecedented levels. We are sitting, we went into this at a time when for the developed economies interest rates were really still at the bottom. We still had a sluggish economy. We didn't have high productivity growth rates. And so we went in a difficult situation, and already macroeconomic policy was challenging. And it's kind of fascinating to sort of see the Australian economy and how we've responded, and the fact that we've really pulled the fiscal policy lever to manage this, and less so the monetary policy lever. And yet a lot of other countries have pulled both levers. And so the real question is, what are these levers going to do, and how are we going to come out of this? And so I'm really excited to launch COVID-19 and the macroeconomy with CAMA, because we need the collective expertise and thinking and that kind of really vibrant debate about how do we get macroeconomic policy settings right? How do they vary with the conditions of the different countries? And so I'm really thrilled to be part of this, and welcome the initiative, and I think it's just great. So with that, I'm very pleased to turn it over to the panel and to learn a lot about what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny, for your very, very kind introduction, and we look forward to interacting more with policymakers like you going into the future. Okay, so tonight we have an outstanding panel of economists from Europe, Asia, and Australia who are beginning to grapple with the economic issues that are arising through the evolution of the COVID-19. So I would first like to extend my thanks to our panelists who are sharing their expertise with us tonight. So before introducing our panelists, so this is how we will proceed. I will maybe ask all of our panelists to please turn on their video screens. So we'll have a short presentation by Professor Warwick McKibben on his work with Roshan Fernando on the global economic consequences of the pandemic based on new data on how the crisis is unfolding. Following that, we will hear presentations from our 4 panelists, and then we'll open up to the audience for discussion. But let me briefly begin by introducing our panelists, who are all research associates of CAMA. So Warwick McKibben, if you see him in one of the corners of your frames, is a professor of public policy and director of the Centre for Applied Macroeconomic Analysis in the Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. He's a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia and non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC. Professor McKibben served for a decade on the board of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and he was appointed an officer in the Order of Australia in 2016. Our second panelist is coming to us from Italy, Francesco Rabazzolo.
Good evening.
Francesco is a full professor of econometrics at the Faculty of Economics and Management at the Free University of Bolzano. He was previously principal researcher and deputy director at the research department of Norges Bank, an adjunct professor at the economics department in the BI Norwegian Business School. His research focuses on Bayesian econometrics, energy economics, financial econometrics, and macroeconometrics. Our third panelist is coming to us from Malaysia, in Anela Munro. Anela the Asian School of Business in Malaysia in 2019. Before that, she was senior advisor at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, where she worked on micro and macro-prudential policy and the Financial Stability Report. She was senior economist at the Bank for International Settlements in Hong Kong, and before that at the Asian Development Bank. Her research interests are international macroeconomics, macro modelling, macro-prudential policy, and international finance. Her current work focuses on modelling monetary policy and risk. Our fourth panelist is Joachim Vespignani from Tasmania. Joachim is co-director of the COVID-19 and the macroeconomy program and an associate professor at the University of Tasmania, where he was head of economics and finance for 4 years. His research focuses on applied macroeconomics and energy economics. He was also a principal associate a research associate of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, and was principal economist for Australia and New Zealand for Barclays International Investment Bank. Our final panelist is Karina Day. Karina is an associate professor of economics in the Crawford School of Public Policy. She founded and directs the Growth, Demographic and Productivity Research Program in CAMA. Karina's research focuses on R&D-based economic growth, house prices and household debt, gender wage inequality, optimal fiscal fuel extraction, and fiscal policy. So if you would like to ask a question of one of our panelists tonight, you'll see a box on your Zoom screen with the label Q&A. So you can type your question into that box, and our panelists, if they have a chance, will be able to respond to you through the chats. But if there is a question that you particularly like, or you read a question that someone else has written that you really like, you could vote for that question to be asked. So you'll see a little thumb signal, a symbol on the Q&A question boxes. So we will pass out the most popular questions for the panelists to answer at the end of the presentations based on the popularity from our audience. I would also like to let you know that this event is being recorded and will be available on the CAMA webpage tomorrow. So just to make the attendees at home feel comfortable, the audience can't see you unless you've been invited to join the panel. So you can sit around in your pajamas and drink your gin and tonics and no one will know the difference. Okay, so I would, before I turn over to Warwick McKibben, I would like to introduce you to Roshan Fernando, who is his co-author on the work that they have been doing. So I'm just going to bring you onto the screen. He's a PhD student. Just gotta start his video. Oh, there we go. He's a PhD student at ANU. So he started at the start of this year and has already made a huge impact by, this is his second paper that he's written on the pandemic. So Roshan, wave, good, okay. So now I'll pass over to Warwick McKibben to give his presentation. I've just got to, can you unmute yourself?
How's that?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And thanks very much, Renee, for the introduction. And thank you to you and Joaquin for putting together this outstanding program together with the help from Rosanna Bastos Pinto, who's the CAMA administrator. This is, as Jenny Gordon said, this is a very important program. And I really appreciate all of the research associates of CAMA who have come together so quickly to work on this absolutely important question facing the world economy. The presentation tonight, there's a lot of material and I only have 30 minutes, so I'm going to give you a taste of what we're doing. This is a totally different paper to the earlier paper on 7 scenarios. This is a new paper with Roshan Fernando. It's called Global Macroeconomic Scenarios of the COVID-19 Pandemic. The paper itself should be available by the weekend, but there will be a capacity to look through the results through a dashboard in the coming days. And I'll give you an example of this dashboard during the presentation if technology doesn't fail me. So what I want to do in this presentation is just draw out the key messages from the beginning, talk about the general approach we use, a little discussion of the G-cube model, and then talk about 4 scenarios. There are many different scenarios we could have looked at, and it takes a lot of work to put these scenarios together. But it's interesting just to focus on these 4 scenarios for tonight. So what are the key messages? Well, one of the key messages is the historical approach that we've seen in the literature of calculating the costs of pandemics, looking just at how many people died and how many people couldn't go to work, really underestimates the true economic costs. I mean, pandemics have devastating consequences, as we've seen from the COVID-19 outbreak, and we saw from SARS and we saw from bird flu historically. And when you look through the impacts, it's mainly how people respond to the disease rather than the disease itself that caused the problem. People's responses are important. They change their behaviour. Policy responses are important. And as we've seen from COVID-19, both of these have been very large. Therefore, if we know that this is a problem, and it's probably a recurring problem, we have been expecting a pandemic for some time, there's a really strong case for investment in prevention, as well as investing in the capacity to respond, not just in the rich countries, but in all countries in the world, because these diseases know no borders. Even when you physically erect borders, you still get transmission. Another key message is we still don't fully understand COVID-19. There's been an enormous amount of research done on the disease, but it's still evolving. And there's still a lot of issues that need to be understood. No one can say with certainty anything about COVID-19, and certainly what I'll talk about tonight has a very large amount of uncertainty surrounding it. But the idea of these scenarios is to give policymakers an idea of just how expensive it might be if you don't respond, and to give you some ideas of how different responses might have economic implications. So what's the general approach? The general approach is we're using an approach developed by Zhonghua Li and myself. Zhonghua Li's professor at Korea University, when we evaluated the SARS pandemic for the World Health Organization in 2003. We published the paper in 2004, and we extended it for avian influenza with a PhD student, Alexandra Sidorenko. What we do in this approach is we start with the epidemiological scenarios. So we have information on virus infection rates, how quickly the virus spreads, the case mortality rates, how many people die from the virus. And what's even more important from an economic point of view is not how many people die, but actually how many people are sick, and also people staying at home looking after people who are sick. So the morbidity effects generally are larger in terms of the effect on labour supply than the loss of life, particularly when we look at COVID-19, because COVID-19 is generally taking people who are outside the labour force in terms of those most vulnerable, and we do adjust for that in this new study. So once we've got the epidemiological information, we then look at what's happened in various countries, and we developed a set of economic variables so that economic shocks, which are based on indicators of exposure of each economy to a range of policy responses. For example, which parts of which sectors will be closed down, how will people change their behaviour, stop going to supermarkets, stop going to movie theatres, stop going to restaurants. So we try and work at the individual level to get a set of shocks to observe both the individual behavioural changes of companies and people, and also how governments respond by closing down different sectors. We then take all this information, the epidemiological information and the economic shocks, and implement them in a global economic model. Now, there are some key differences between this paper and the 7 scenario paper, which I'm sure you've all read, but if you haven't, what we're using in this case is we're actually using the epidemiological data that we observed up until the 7th of May 2020. So instead of predicting how the epidemic would spread across countries, we actually have the data on the epidemiological outcomes. So we don't need to use any of the historical pandemic data, which really form the cause of the transmission in the scenarios paper and the scale of the economic shocks. So we don't need to endogenize the transmission. We take the transmission as we observe it. We also break the link between the epidemiological shocks and how we then map them onto economic shocks. We are now seeing the economic shocks. So what we're doing is we're shocking the economy in the way that we actually see is happening in real time. Now, this means, of course, that this paper, it takes a long time to put the data together, and 7th of May was the latest data we had to put together for tonight's presentation. So what do you need to model? What are the economic shocks? Firstly, there's the reduction in the labour force. We have changes in mortality, people die. We have illness, people can't go to work, and we have people stay at home looking after people who are ill. We have big increases in business costs differentiated by sector. So it costs a lot more at the moment, it costs a very large amount to run a cafe. It costs a very large amount to run a gym, almost infinity in fact. Most gyms closed in most countries. There are economic shutdowns mandated by government. And when you shut down parts of the economy, you shut down and disrupt production chains. And because our model has many sectors, we trace the linkages between sectors, across sectors, and into the macroeconomy. People also change their behaviour. You get a big shift in consumer preferences. People don't want to go into places where there are groups of people. Sometimes that's because it's mandated by government, but most of the change in behaviour is actually individual choice rather than government mandate. This is where I think this false debate that we see in the popular press about the trade-off between economics and health is actually, the closures aren't really the big problem. The disease and the response to the disease by individuals is where most of the economic damage gets done. We then look at how it might impact on country risk and sector risk of people investing in various sectors. And we also, as I mentioned, talk about the policy responses from a health point of view, but also we focus on the fiscal and monetary responses that Jenny Gordon spoke about at the beginning. So in that original 7 scenario study, just to remind you, we wrote that before it was a pandemic. So we had 3 scenarios where the outbreak was constrained in China, so there was no pandemic. We had 3 scenarios where there was a global pandemic, and we based them on the 3 major influenza pandemics of the 20th century. And then we had one scenario which was a permanent recurring pandemic to show the impact of a permanent shock versus temporary shocks. So in this paper, we've got 4 new scenarios. 3 main ones and then a small adjustment. The first scenario is we assume that what countries have done in the last 4 months as of 4th of May is sufficient to restrict the pandemic to a more mild, to the level we observe right now. And then in the second year, 2021, there is a re-emergence of the pandemic, but it's only half the amount this year, and it goes away. So that means for all countries, policies are successful. They're very different across countries, but we assume they're all successful. And in fact, we've managed to, all the countries have flattened their curve as of the 4th of May, 2020. The second scenario then is what happens if you release the lockdowns at that point, and it turns out it's too early and the pandemic recurs in the entire second quarter of 2020. So now we have an increase and another surge in deaths, another surge in morbidity, another set of shutdowns. But we assume in the second half of the year, because countries have learnt from their experience in the first half of the year, that the shocks that are hitting are only half as big over the next 8 months in 4 month blocks than they were in the beginning of the pandemic. And then we assume that in 2021, there is a re-emergence of the pandemic at half the level of the 2020 experience. So this is a case where you open too early and you lose control of the pandemic. The third scenario is where the lockdowns they get open, they very quickly, the pandemic surges, all countries lock down again. They lock down throughout 2020. So not the entire economy, but all the sectors that are deemed to be not essential get locked down. And we have data on that for each country. This pandemic is still uncontrolled. And so this goes on to 2021. And by the end of 2021, you've had 2 years of very large amount of lockdown, very large amount of deaths and destruction. And then eventually there's a vaccine, and the vaccine saves the world in 2022. And the fourth scenario is just one of the key policies, and particularly for Australia, is the JobKeeper policy in Australia, which is a wage subsidy policy where wages are subsidised at 80% of previous levels. That is a very substantial policy, and so we want to look at what happens if that policy hadn't been put in the first scenario. Now there are other scenarios which we've thought about, and one would be, what if in fact the pandemic just keeps continuing on a gradually lower scale each year? We haven't done that analysis just yet. And another scenario you could talk about would be, well, we just haven't got to that. Let me come back to that at the end if there's time. So what's the model we're using? I don't want to spend too much time on the model, but for the economists in the room, it is useful to know what the model is. It's called G-Cubed. It's a model developed with Peter Wilcoxon, currently working with Larry Liu, one of my colleagues at ANU, doing lots of innovation in this model. For those who are interested, their documentation is in the Handbook of CGE Modelling. And this model is widely used by governments, corporations for scenario planning, policy analysis, and also used for research. The way to think of this model is and again, for the non-economists, I apologize, but it's useful for those who are working in this area. It's a hybrid of a dynamics DSG model, which we see in central banks, and a computable general equilibrium model that we see used for trade and tax policy. We capture the linkages across industries, across countries through trade, capital allocation. We model investment, consumption. It's an annual model, but the dynamics are sectoral dynamics. And there's a lot of frictions in the model. We have frictions in the labour market. We have capital accumulation subject to adjustment costs. So in the very long run, the world ends up with full employment, but it takes a long time to get there. And labour can move across sectors, but can't move across regions. The model itself is a very large model. As you can see from this slide, there are the G20 countries. Then there are 4 additional regions to capture the rest of the world. There are 6 sectors of production: energy, mining, agriculture, durable manufacturing, non-durable manufacturing, and services. And then in each country, we have a representative household, 2 types of households, one who are optimizing and one who are liquidity constrained. A representative firm in each of the 6 sectors, one of which is liquidity constrained, and the other one is able to borrow and is forward-looking. We have a government, we have a central bank in each country. I should mention the documentation can be found in a paper with Adam Triggs and I, which is in the references at the end of the presentation. So then we take this model. It's a very complex model because the future evolution of the world affects people's expectations in the present. So it's quite complex, the numerical problem we're solving, because people are using the model to forecast the future. So what we do is we solve the model from 2016 to 2100. We make assumptions about population growth by country, productivity growth by sector, assumptions about technology, policy rules, etc. And then we introduce a pandemic in 2020. No one saw it coming, but once it's there, you know all about it. So in each scenario, you have an idea of what the future brings. The 30% of firms and households that have rational expectations, they look forward and they respond knowing it's either a bad pandemic or not a bad pandemic. And there's 70% who just follow a rule of thumb. So how do we create the epidemiological shocks? Well, we're using the actual case infection rates and the case mortality rates as of the 7th of May for each economy. So this effectively assumes that everybody's curve has been flattened by the 7th of May. Now that's not true, certainly, for Brazil and for other countries who are just coming into the pandemic now. And that may be something that we need to modify as we go forward. Now, to put the shocks into the economic model, we've got to model shutdowns, we've got to model people's changes in technology and tastes, etc. So the main shocks we worry about are reduced labour supply in different countries from mortality, morbidity and people caring, increased costs of doing business, increases in the equity risk premium. We also deal with the country risk premium, which is not in this slide, and we look at how people change their consumption preferences. We also look at how people change their consumption because they discount the future at a higher rate because they're now more uncertain about the future. Now, this slide is quite interesting and complicated, and Roshan should get some sort of award for putting this together. But this is how we construct the shock to labour force. So over here on the right-hand side, the variable we're trying to shock is labour supply that's going into each sector. So what we have is a whole lot of information. We've got cases and the death rates for all countries, and we break it down by age group where available. So we want to distinguish between someone who died, who's retired, versus someone who died, who's working, because one impacts on the labour force and the other one doesn't. So we have a capacity then looking at case fatality rates and infection rates by age, different across different countries. And then we can work out how many dependents will be infected, how many working age population will be infected. We also will work out how much of the labour force composition will change, because we assume that there will be more of the female labour force will become carers than the male labour force in different societies, and we try and take that into account. And these things all feed into morbidity, people not working because they're sick or people not working because they're looking after others. And then we look at, in terms of the closures, some people can work at home. So we have data from that Roshan has put together, looking at the proportion of workers in a particular sector who can work at home by occupation. So we can map those occupations into the sectors of the model. We can look at the proportion of workers in the broader sectors, and we can look at the proportion of sectors that are operating amidst shutdowns, sectors that are called essential sectors. And that comes from a recent paper by Del Rio and Shanona. And so we can actually work out then how many of the workers are still working from home, even though their sector may have been closed. From a worker point of view, they can still produce in that sector. And then we can scale this by the length of the shutdowns. Is it 4 months? Is it 8 months? Is it 12 months? Is it 2 years? And so it gives us an estimate of the morbidity. This morbidity is potentially much, much larger than mortality, but the mortality is permanent. Okay, now the next shock is what happens to the cost of doing business. And so this is the same as if your cost of doing business go up per unit of output, then that's the same as your productivity going down. So we're working out how to shock productivity. So we have a look and see, we look at what labour is going into what sector, how many workers can work at home, what occupation categories they're in, which sectors are actually operating during the shutdown, and what sectors are drawing inputs from other sectors. And so we get these impact of inputs lost due to inability of workers to go to work and due to operational shutdowns. And so we get an estimate that we can feed into, for the average for the sector, a productivity shock for that sector. Now, the next set of shocks are how people shift their preferences and how they change their behaviour. The model itself models consumption, but it models consumption, people responding to income and relative price changes. What we're looking at are the behavioural changes that are actually exogenous to the model. And so we can look at which sectors are shut down, who's not going to restaurants, which sectors people are reducing their demand from. And we can also look at how much do consumers change their risk about the way they discount their future income. And so we construct some volatility indexes from from the US, and we look at some indexes of risk aversion. And so we use these to calculate, this bottom part affects the calculation of human wealth. This top part affects the consumption spending overall and the allocation across sectors. And we put them together and we can scale them depending on the severity of the shutdown. And that gives us the consumption shock. Now we have to look at what happens to country risk, because what investors are going to be pulling their money out of some countries that are high risk and putting it into some assets which are low risk, or some other countries which are low risk. So to construct the country risk shocks, we construct an index of health risk, an index of governance risk, an index of financial risk, an index of vulnerability to the pandemic. These are all similar to what we did in the earlier paper, but we then also take into account the variance of financial markets in the US to get an idea of how much risk premia are actually changing in the US, and then mapping that onto the risk premia in the other countries. And so the net effect is the net risk premia for the countries outside the US. We also shock equity risk premia. And so we're changing, we're looking at which sectors are most exposed, and they're the ones who would be less likely to want to invest in from a riskiness point of view. And we look at the volatility, so the variance of the equity price changes on the sectors that map onto our model, and then we take that and we calibrate all the countries based on the experience in Australia, just because we didn't have access to the global data on that. Now, the other issues that are important is how much fiscal policy came very quickly into the market. And so we have information on all the economic stimulus packages. Now, we want to separate the spending by government from the wage subsidies by government. And in Australia's case, far more of the budget deficit is a wage subsidy than it is a spending program. And so we're using data from a whole range of sources to get the amount of government spending. And then we assume in the base scenario 1, where we are right now, when we then move into different scenarios, we scale up the amount of spending depending on the severity of the changes in the economy. And so that is changed over time, as if the government does exactly the same thing given the shock they face. And then the final thing we do is we calculate the wage subsidies. Now, then if you look at how big are the shocks, this is what happens to the infections in each country under the different scenarios. These are the case infections. So in Australia, we get, as of the date of May 7th, we get 6,896 cases. We're a little bit above that now. Scenario 2, because it breaks out, because we get another outbreak, we get to 10,344. In scenario 3, we get 13,792. That is double that, because it's twice as bad. So you can see that there's still a lot of infections in a lot of countries. At the moment, the US is sitting at probably around that number, in fact, above that number. So what do we do with the risk premium? Well, again, I won't go through all of these, but you can see the numbers are very different across countries, and they're very different across scenarios. What happens to the equity risk premium on different sectors? Very different across sectors, very different across countries. What happens to the costs of production? Very different across sectors and very different across countries. And finally, what happens to households' discounting of human wealth? It changes dramatically in a lot of these economies. And then finally, the consumption demand shocks are in this table. Now, the government spending shocks are actually, take Australia, we've got 1.3% of GDP here. In fact, the wage subsidy itself is 6.4% of GDP. So the budget deficit is going up a lot, but most of it's not spending, most of it is income support. And you can see that we scale it up across the scenarios. This is the size of the wage subsidies in countries that have wage subsidies. Australia by far has the largest wage subsidy as a share of GDP. And again, this is assuming that the subsidy stops in September when the subsidy runs out and it's not restarted, except in the other scenarios where the disease recurs. So let me look at the results, because I'm getting a little bit short of time. So these are the death rates we get. So take Australia. So scenario 1, we get 97 deaths. At the moment, we just got 100 today. Scenario 2, it gets up to 146 and 194. This is very different to the previous paper where we were using the data from the Spanish flu, the Hong Kong flu, and the Asian flu. So these numbers are much, much smaller than those. But in some other countries, we're getting very large numbers. If we look at the US, 75,000, that's now over 100,000 because we've still continued since May the 7th. And scenario 2, it gets up to 113, which is probably where we are right now. Now, what happens to GDP? Now, if you look at scenario 1, you can see for Australia, Australia's GDP is down nearly 10%. So that is the loss of GDP over the entire year. All of these shocks have been scaled. Even though they're short-term 4-month shocks, we aggregate them up to make it into an annualized shock for the year. So you see, so some countries, particularly in France and Italy, we've got some very large numbers, and in the US, 13% loss of GDP. If this reopening occurs and it's not the right thing to do, these numbers jump massively. If it turns out that this goes on for 2 years, this is a devastating effect on the global economy. So what I want to do is, just to finish up, this is a dashboard that we've developed, and hopefully if I click on that, it will work. So this is what will be available in the next few days at the CARMA website. What you can do is you can actually go in and you can look at your favorite country and see what the impacts are. So given my favorite country is Australia, let me pick Australia. And you can see the scenarios. Now we're going to change the labeling a little bit, but this shows you the change in GDP relative to what it would have been. So if you look at the scenario 1, which is our estimate of where we are right now, GDP is down around 10% relative to what it would have been. If you look at scenario 2, where this reopening is done too quickly and we get a surge in the second half of the year, you get a 25% loss of, in fact, you can put this over the top, I think. Yeah, you get a 25% fall in GDP. Now, because we assume the pandemic eventually goes away, the economy does bounce back reasonably quickly in 2021. And in the third scenario, it doesn't bounce back as quickly because the pandemic lasts for 2 years. So you do get a recovery, even with the pandemic at the intensity it is for the first year, repeated in the second year. Just a couple of things I'll highlight here. One is that the real interest rate effects of the pandemic are quite significant. So for the one we're observing, we're probably getting about a 7% fall in real interest rates. But if it becomes a really large pandemic, real interest rates can fall very dramatically. The key thing before I finish is just to look at employment. So look at 2020, these are the 3 outcomes. The fourth scenario is what the JobKeeper, if you didn't have the JobKeeper policy, what would the unemployment rate change by? It would have fallen by 12.8. And we estimate, therefore, the JobKeeper has benefited unemployment by 2.5%. Unemployment would be a lot higher by 2.5% than if you didn't have the JobKeeper program. But you can see that if we make a mistake and we open too quickly and we get a recurrence over 2 years, we end up with a very, very deep global recession. And you can see that in the Australian employment numbers. Okay, so let me get back to the presentation. And so let me just sum up. So what we learned from this exercise is that if you fail to act, if you can't stop the pandemic at the very beginning, then there's even a mild pandemic can have very large economic costs. So the failure to prevent the pandemic is a very costly exercise. Once the pandemic enters in and breaks out, there's not a great deal you can do to prevent it. So then the question between do you open or close the economy becomes a much harder question to answer, because if you can't stop the economy, can't stop the pandemic by closing the economy because it's totally out of control, like in the US, is there any point closing the economy at all at that point? Australia and New Zealand are not at that point. We're at the point where we made the right choices and now we can manage to live with the coronavirus. A key point to take out at the end is that, again, most of the costs of the pandemic aren't the pandemic. Most of the costs are the behavioural changes of households and firms to the fear of the disease, and some of it is due to the government policies of sector closing. So in conclusion, it's tough to do this sort of work. There's a lot of estimates in this research. There's a lot of uncertainty, but the bottom line is if you can prevent the pandemic by investing in prevention, it's a much better rate of return than almost anything else you can do. And therefore preemption in developing countries is a sound investment. And the way you do that is you improve public health systems, you change the way people interact with animals, you increase the awareness of the dangers of animals, you introduce much better hygiene management techniques, and you reduce poverty. And there's a list of references that'll be on the website if people want to follow up. And the model itself is documented at gcube.com. And I will stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Warwick. So remember, if you would like to pose questions about Warwick's presentation or anything else, head to the Q&A balloons at the bottom of your screen and remember to vote on the questions. Our next panelist is going to be Francesco Ravazzolo. So I'll ask him to come to the screen.
So thank you, Renee, Joaquin, to start this great initiative. and thank all the people to listen to us. So good evening. Here is morning in Europe. I'm in Bolzano. So let me say one word before to add my screen and share my slides. Of course, you all know we got hit as country, as region, but in particular as country. We had many people that catch the virus, many people that died, unfortunately, particularly in the north of the country. Eventually, I'm originally from one of the two small cities where it started in Italy, the east part. There was less problem in the east part. It was mainly on the north, in the central north part of Italy. However, from this week, Bolzano, from the previous week, we started reopening. Let's see how we go. Up to now, it seems we are under control in terms of new cases. Hopefully, we can stay on scenario 1 from Warwick presentation. So what I'm going to discuss today, and let me share my screen. So I put my slide on. Is some figures about Europe to start with. I hope you see my slide at the moment. I think yes, it tells me that I can see. Otherwise, let me know, René. Let's move on with the figures. So let me start with some numbers from Europe. So here you have the GDP growth in the euro area in the last 1 year, and 3 countries that got hit severely, at least in terms of casualties relative to others. And as you can see, as Warwick was mentioning before, the negative growth is, we got hit severely also from an economic point of view. Italy, this is the first release. Let's see what will be the last one. So Italy had the GDP growth around -5%, 4.7. France even worse, and Spain is just a bit better at the moment than Italy. On average, Europe is reporting below -3% the annual growth on the first quarter. And we will see what will be the effect also on the second quarter, because remember that we locked down. Basically, Italy was one of the first to lock down from the beginning of March. And this quarter probably will have even larger effect. Let me focus on my country with a couple of slides. And we're looking for data, and of course there are not so many data at the moment. In particular, macroeconomic variables are released with delays. So we are trying to understand, and I thought to use some data from social media, and this is based on Twitter, and is produced by Istat. It should give an idea of how the feeling, at least, about the economics is going. So first cases that we reported in Italy were around middle of February, when large numbers were starting to increase, or at least to reveal. As you can see, went down heavily. And when we start to talk about reopening, you can see a bit of bump. There was some delay. The government made a bit of mess eventually, and you can see how the index has evolved. But an important variable I want to discuss more is the labor market in general. And here I'm reporting 2 graphs that I think requires a bit of explanation. In blue, we have the unemployment rate, which is decreasing. It has decreased in the last 5 years, but is even decreasing here. So here we are basically in March and April. This is not yet April, sorry, in March 2020. And the other one is the inactivity rate. So what is happening in Italy at the moment? Firms by law cannot fire at the moment. So we are keeping the permanent workforce stable by law. Of course, this is at the moment we are doing that. Let's see what will happen. I mean, by law we can keep this ratio stable only for a period. Obviously, sooner or later, funding will go out. What is happening then? It seems that artificially we are working with a number to reduce the unemployment rate, but eventually what is already happening is that large part of the population is moving out of the labor market, and the inactivity ratio went already up of 2%, which is not a tiny number if you think. And I'm expecting this number will increase even more. So I'm expecting that sooner or later we will have the unemployment rate increasing, despite the working force being smaller, and then and therefore the inactivity ratio will also increase, will keep increasing. The inactivity ratio is one of the largest problem eventually in Italy, and somewhat a problem in all Europe, that we have a part of the population that is not even entering in the labor market. So there is even no idea how to support those people. So related to that, and considering that René organized the event, I thought to present a couple of slides of a work I'm doing with one of my PhD student, and is a work on a structural VAR model focusing on labor productivity. And what we are doing, myself and Joe Di Bonbuena, my PhD student, is proposing a large structural VAR model based on sign restrictions. We are interested to identify many shocks in the labor market and use them to understand how evolves labor productivity and also labor force participation. So you realize from the previous graph that we have an issue that, at least in Italy, that there is not a large participation. And also the other issue is that in general is more than 10, 15 years that we have a decreasing labor productivity. We will use as data, we have not yet COVID data at the moment, probably will take a bit of time. You understood from the graph before why, because
Francesco,
yeah.
And someone would like to ask you a quick question. Trang,
Please.
You're allowed to talk. Trang?
Sorry, it's my mistake. My son touched it.
Okay.
No question. Sorry about this.
Keep going.
Yeah. So.
Francesco.
No worries. You can always stop me for questions or ask it later on.
Hi.
Good. So, yeah.
Yeah.
I go. So what will come out that our results seems to indicate that investment and labor market shocks are among the largest drivers of macroeconomic fluctuations, and we will tackle both with the next few graphs. So Italian labor productivity, first of all, a graph. So it's not only a COVID problem. So you do see that basically from beginning of 2000, we had a productivity which was at the best just positive, but in several periods, it went even down. So just before the crisis, the beginning of the crisis, or the financial crisis, there was a push up on that. We'll come back on this element. Then let me focus 1 second on the VAR. So the one that I'm showing you is the baseline model as we define. It has 6 variables, so it's not a large model as the one that Warwick presented, but still we have some variables to play with. That those variables are GDP, labor productivity, prices, real wage, unemployment rate, and we also play investment over GDP. And we try to identify in this model 6 different shocks. One is restricted, the other 5 are shocks that I assume economists know what we're talking about, that those are supply, demand, so traditional shocks. These are currently more related to the labor market, and in particular we play with the wage bargain, labor supply, and then we have an investment shock that can hit basically all the economy. There are restrictions, believe on me, the shocks are identified if you play with the plus and minus, and we can leave labor productivity unrestricted. All the shocks are impact. Why we decide that? Because we really do not know how in the long term will go the labor market and what will happen. And I'm plotting you the variance decomposition. So basically for each of the 6 variables we discussed before, what are the shocks? So the 5 shocks I discussed that are explaining most of the movements. Let's focus for a couple of seconds on labor productivity. So the top right of the screen where I am. And as you can see is the light green the most important one, which is investment. Of course, none of these shocks are non-important. They all have some importance. They also differ across variables. As you can see, in general, supply is important for all those variables, but also, as I was mentioning, several labor shocks are playing a non-trivial role. So these two are the labor shocks in this exercise. Let me show you 1 second the labor productivity shock, what is doing for all the 6 variables. And I will spend 1 moment here. So you do see this is a positive shock to the growth. By the way, variables are in level. That's why you see in log level, you see these numbers here. So we take up GDP, takes up prices, unemployment on the positive side goes down, investment, this is the investment shock, goes up. And what is the most striking is probably here. Labor productivity is negative. We will all expect in one way that investment is a shock that is increasing some sort of labor productivity. Why this is happening? There are more analyses in the paper that we are writing, but I want to just keep my time under control. I just want to show you the historical decomposition of labor productivity. So this is labor productivity in the baseline model is the growth that the baseline model is expecting. Here you really see that is negative during the 2008. There were some reforms that pushed the different definition. That's why it went up. But when you remove for that shock, through data, you really see that is heavily negative. And we didn't recover very well. And when we enter in the European debt crisis, we had another period of negative labor productivity. And here you can already see that in 2018, we were in a negative area. So probably it will be worse and worse at the moment. Basically, in this graph, investment is the light blue this time. And you do see what happens. Every time we are in a difficult period, the investment vanishes. So there isn't any effect from the investment shocks. Usually investment shocks are positive, also in Italy, to labor productivity. However, our government doesn't run any counter-cyclical policy. We all know the debt of Italy is very high. Probably the planning is not very good. So when we enter in the crisis, the government is the first to shut off investments, and that creates big problems. Most of the time, all the investments or large part of the investments is left to firms. Of course, entering the crisis, private firms have more issues to run a counter-cyclical policy. And that explains in this model why we have a quite negative labor productivity. There is more analysis in this paper, and we also find that another typical issue, I would say, of Italy, somewhat in general of Europe, at least the south of Europe, we have problems with the matching shocks. So the working force, the demand and the supply of workers is not matched very well. Typically issue that we have not qualified people that firms are looking for. So to conclude, the situation is pretty difficult for Italy looking to these numbers because the COVID is shutting down, unfortunately, investments. And probably we are stopping also schools and education at the moment. The good point that there are several European projects to push investments both in education and in the labor market. So those probably will help or should help the Italian economy, and maybe they can improve the graph that I just showed you. And I stop here, otherwise I'm going too long.
Okay, thank you, Francesco. So our next panelist is Anela Munro.
Oops. Thanks, Renee. I think you can hear me, but I haven't turned on my video. Have you turned it on?
I can do it. You can start talking.
Thanks. Okay. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this panel on issues and challenges with COVID-19. Today, I want to talk a little bit about risk sharing. How have we done, and how does that affect the recovery? I'd argue that COVID-19 is another example of poor sharing of aggregate risk in a crisis. Policy has come to the rescue in some countries very successfully, but poor risk sharing inhibits the recovery, and policy only works in countries where you have the space and the size and the sort of institutional capacity. So going forward, do we want to embed new policies, or do we want to have a fundamental rethink? I would argue a bit of both. So what do I mean by risk sharing? I'm thinking of aggregate versus idiosyncratic risk. A lot of what we do is set up for idiosyncratic risk and moral hazard to make sure we make good decisions. And when talking about aggregate risk, it's something widespread, not something that people or firms or even governments know is coming or have control over. It's not caused by them, so it's really not about moral hazard. And classic examples are the weather or a pandemic, and just acknowledging Australia's had both in the course of a year. So as economists, it would be normal to think that stronger balance sheets would bear more of the risk. That's what any welfare analysis in a model would tell us. The idea goes back a long way to the Hammurabi Code in ancient Mesopotamia, where in the event of drought, interest was not to be paid. I think in subsequent crises, we've been reminded of this after the GFC. Mian and Sufi reminded us in their papers in their book House of Debt that really a lot of this aggregate risk had fallen on the debtor household. So I want to think about the Hammurabi example as it's sort of a diktat that the private sector is going to share this risk, and compare that with the public sector coming in to share the risk. So in the COVID-19 crisis, who's bearing the risk? I think it's another example where it's really fallen on those least able to bear it. The graph that Jenny showed at the beginning with the rise in US unemployment, I think Chairman Powell said the other day, 40% of people with incomes below $40,000 have lost their jobs. Next door in Canada, it's more of a welfare state, but less, it's still, I think, for people who earn less than about 18 Australian dollars equivalent per hour, 50% have either lost their jobs or had their hours cut by more than half. Contrast that to people who earn more than $50 an hour, and it's only about 1% have lost their jobs or had their hours cut by more than half. There are other countries, and Germany comes to mind with Kurzarbeit, who've managed to keep unemployment lower, and Francesco mentioned the Italian example of an inability to fire during the shutdown. It's also fallen on small firms, particularly service sector firms. We've come in to support with mostly loans, sometimes grants, not so much with equity, which some might argue for. And again, you know, some governments have saved jobs, some have tried to catch those who lose their jobs, but again, a lot of governments don't have the space or the tax base or the sort of institutional capacity. So this is sort of an advanced versus an emerging economy story to some extent. So government balance sheets, they should come into play. They're well placed to absorb aggregate risk, at least in theory they should be. And I think in contrast to prior narrative, in a lot of advanced countries, fiscal policy has been flexible, agile. Automatic stabilizers obviously come into play, people who are doing well, paying more tax, but also on the spending side in terms of supporting unemployed and helping firms get through. Monetary policy, we don't usually think in terms of risk sharing. It's not in the mandate, but I think what central banks do, they wouldn't say so because it's not in their mandate, but debt service relief is a transfer from creditors to borrowers, from those who can bear the risk almost by definition better than those who have weaker balance sheets. So it's interest rate cuts, but even when you hit the zero lower bound, you can give a debt service holiday with funding for lending, and even trying to reach down to small businesses. The Fed's recent special purpose vehicle for that. To some extent, you could think of also getting debt service relief from longer maturity interest rate policy. I'm thinking QE, asset purchases, forward guidance. I think, yeah, to some degree, but that's really the sovereign curve. And so I'm thinking of that more as supporting fiscal sustainability in a crisis situation, which I think is a great idea in a crisis situation and a terrible idea in normal times. So useful contributions to risk sharing, not in central bank mandates. We don't usually talk about them. But most of the contract, in a way, the problem is more in the private sector, I think, in the contracts we write. The debt contract, for example, is really on the debtor. If you get a mortgage, you put in some equity, you get a loan, the house price falls, you get wiped out first. Sure, you get the gains on the upside as well, but in the event of aggregate risk, you're really bearing it. And is that appropriate? Is that how we want it to work? And if you think of, if you want to manage your debt, you can repay it, you can outgrow it, you can inflate it away, you can have somebody give you a low interest rate. And that R minus G component in this kind of aggregate event, G is hugely negative. Well, gosh, a nominal interest rate of R looks pretty amazing from a creditor's side. It looks terrible from a debtor's side when G is, we're talking about -5, -10% in some cases. You could make similar arguments about other types of contracts, but again, this is not about moral hazard, and I think these contracts often reflect bargaining power rather than what the welfare maximizing central planner would recommend for an aggregate event. So I think a useful thought experiment is, imagine the economy goes on holiday, and then they go back to work at the end. That's a sort of classic V-shaped recovery, and the question is, how do you want to finance that to best get the economy going again? Well, again, you want people who can bear the risk to bear the risk, and then they can be busy investing and doing whatever they do to rebuild their balance sheets, but you don't want it to fall on those who can't bear it. And this is a totally unrealistic example, but I think it's also a useful benchmark for thinking about permanent effects and what's going to drag that recovery. I think poor risk sharing ex ante inhibits the recovery ex post. Employment separations, yeah, sure, some people need to change jobs for the new economy, but that really inhibits this going back to work after the holiday. And debt inhibits the recovery. Households don't want to spend, they want to repay their debt. Firms don't want to invest and hire. So a kind of just conceptual question is, do we want to embed these rescue policies, or do we want a more fundamental rethink? I think probably some of them we want to keep. I think some of the wage and job policies we probably want to keep. On the getting more risk sharing going on in the economy, I think is desirable, and a sort of extreme version of that might be, who has the authority to produce the diktat that says interest will not be paid during the shutdown, and rents will not be paid, or under certain contingencies that somebody isn't in a position to pay. So I want to just show a few pictures from China, which I think China is interesting for two reasons. One is it experienced the pandemic earlier, and so we have actually the data to look at the beginnings of recovery. But also because it's, in some ways kind of maybe close to that go on holiday model. So the top left is the PMI, Purchasing Managers Index, gives an idea of activity in the industrial sector, I think. So this is kind of a perfect V-shaped recovery, the line, which is the PMI. Underlying that, there's a little bit more pain in the traded in the blue and red bars that come back in March and then weaken again in April when other countries are experiencing pandemic. the top right, retail sales, kind of an indicator of consumption, and that's been more slow to come back, but is still on a pretty strong recovery path. The bottom right is fixed asset investment. So the bars are the official data which reports year over year, but for an accumulating number of months, which isn't really how we usually look at this, but you can back out what the month-on-month implied rates of growth are. And again, looks like a really nice recovery. And then, yeah, bottom left, just the unemployment rate, as I mentioned before, about 1%. So just one final slide. Yeah, hats off to CAMA for setting up this research stream. I think it's a great idea. Health versus economics. Is there a trade-off? I tend to agree with Warwick that really the goal is get control of the virus and then everybody can go back and the economy can recover. And this nice paper reminds us that uncertainty does matter. Even if we open up, if we don't have control of the virus, then people may not want to go back to work, and this effect is potentially really large. And another paper I saw on the stream, I think once we get control of the virus and we're clear on that goal, then we can start thinking about mitigation cost versus value added, which is a much more comfortable space for firms, for economists, thinking about, what do I want to open up first and what are the trade-offs? This is a nice paper that, looks at spillovers, employment spillovers from different sectors, and focuses on ones that we might want to think about opening up earlier because they have good spillovers. And maybe just on one last positive note, when we think of mitigation cost versus value added, compared to where we were 2 months ago at the beginning of these shutdowns, we didn't have a lot of mitigation tools. You couldn't buy a mask, you couldn't buy hand sanitizers, we were hardly able to test. Now testing is much higher and it's ramping up. You can buy masks and hand sanitizers for cheap. We're learning a lot more. So I'm optimistic going forward, but I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Anela. Our next presenter is Joaquin Vespignani. Joaquin, there you are.
I'm coming. Thank you. Let me share the screen. I'm having some problems to share my screen. Sorry about that. I have problems to share my screen now.
We can see it. I think you just need to Control L.
Control L?
Didn't work.
Where is it? Can you see now the screen there?
Yeah, we can see.
Yep, everyone can see? Good.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, I can see.
Okay, I'm going to present COVID-19 and commodity prices today. Well, as we know, the outbreak of COVID-19 and social distance measures have abruptly disrupt demand and supply chain in most commodities, similar to most markets. Now, there are two crucial commodities that I want to emphasize today because they were were particularly disrupted, and they are very important commodities. One is oil and the other is food. Now, let's start by the case of oil, and with this chart that is, something that we never seen. As you hear before, we keep here the word unprecedented, and here is another one. Well, we know that since early February, oil demand experienced the largest drop in 70 years. due to COVID-19 and social distance measures. Let's clarify that this drop, it was much faster than we never experienced before, because countries were shutting down from one day to another, and that's why there wasn't transport and flights and all that consume oil stop. Definitely the Russia-Saudi Arabia oil price war didn't help. Basically, Russia refused to cut oil production, and that resulted in a big drop in oil prices. As we can see here, the future prices, 1 month future prices, declined to negative 37, which economists, we don't know what that means because it never experienced negative prices, future prices before in this market. Then in May, the OPEC, Russia, and the non-OPEC countries significantly agreed to significantly reduce production. However, this reduction will not be sufficient to prevent a significant inventory build throughout May and June. And we can see here this picture from the U.S. Energy Information Agency is quite revealing. You can see here in blue the world production and the world consumption, and here is the big drop in world consumption. As you can see here in this scale, is a very fast and sharp drop, and production didn't adjust accordingly. And from here we have the forecast. As we can see at the end, here is the storage building in oil. Is expected, the global storage capacity is expected to be completely full by the second quarter of 2020. And then it's expected that if this recovery is V-shaped in terms of oil consumption, oil production is expected to cut, but not so much as we at it should. Now, it is very important to point out that this scenario of oil consumption to recover heavily relies on the assumption that there is not a second outbreak or cases keep growing at global level. That's why they make it this scenario. I mean, this is a big assumption that the recovery of consumption is coming so quick. But yeah, all producers are not so keen on cutting as we see before, and then we're going to see that soon. That. In this part, I'm going to present the COVID-19 and oil price volatility. And why oil price volatility? Well, because the literature is very clear or is very abundant in terms of the negative effect of oil price volatility. The literature basically agreed that lower GDP and manufacturing activity, lower investment, consumption, and employment, higher stock prices volatility as well, and lower stock prices, and lower accumulation of physical and human capital. As we can see here, and as you're going to hear once again, the word unprecedented, the COVID-19 event has created a volatility in oil prices, which is much larger than the volatility in the stock market, and is almost double the volatility that the oil market experienced in the global financial crisis. Yeah. Now, also from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, we have here oil prices, West Texas intermediate prices, and here is the forecast that they are working with. Well, first of all, this is that the future prices of oil. I mean, if you believe in the market efficiency hypothesis, you will probably think that this is the proper forecast. And this is the forecast from the Energy Information Agency. This is the short-term economic outlook. An interesting thing about this forecast is that in almost both scenarios, or well, in the case of the future prices, oil prices will remain below 40 until 2022. And for the agency, it will pass $40 after middle of 2021. Now, now I'm going to talk. And now you're going to see why I'm emphasizing in $40 because it's quite important for production. And this is basically what are the challenges of having such a low oil prices, and what will be the likely consequences. Well, this is, I mean, according to the market futures, is predicting to oil prices to be below $40 until 2022. And that presents the following challenges. First of all, shale oil production, which is mainly in US. Fracking basically is if you know it for another name, require an average price higher than $40 to justify exploration. And that's why now in the data can we see that oil exploration declined 30% in US since February, which is a big decline. And that will have other economic consequences. And that's why it's in US media is so now they are discussing the support of economic support for the oil companies, which seems a little bit weird, but given that they are rich companies, but that could basically reduce significantly oil production in US, and also somehow giving more power to OPEC. The US may move back to be a net importer of oil with this price, because consumption probably in oil will increase if the pandemic improves in US, but at this price, shale oil production really is not feasible, or is feasible, but the risk is much higher. And that's why that is a possible consequence, is that OPEC may regain some power. Similar to shale oil production, offshore oil extraction costs may be higher than oil prices, and that's why that's the same challenge will be experienced by offshore oil extractions, and that's why they probably will cut in production. And finally, renewables energy will find difficult to compete with such a low price of oil. I mean, there was slowly but progress in terms of using renewable energy sources in the last 20 years, but the oil prices, high oil prices help for that to make it more competitive. But now at such a low level, $25 is which is right now, is very hard to compete with oil. And yes. Now, moving to food prices and food security. Well, the world wasn't in a great shape before the pandemic, because prices were expected to surge because of African swine fever wipe out 1/4 of the world pig population in 2019. There also was the worst locust infection in 70 years, which destroyed crops in East Africa. And as we experience here in Australia and many other places, and related to climate change, droughts in Australia, California, and UK, among others, have reduced the global stock of crops and livestock around the world. Now, and then after that, we have the COVID-19 coming on board. And what is happening now with the food prices and the food market? Well, major food producing countries have imposed export ban or quotas in response to the pandemic. For example, the World Bank estimate that protectionism, which is what is now growing with this pandemic, in terms of oil security, in terms of food. The World Bank estimate that protectionism accounts for 40% of the increase in global price of wheat and 25% of maize. And as we see in many cities in the world, and this is from the supply side, the disruption in supply side, but in the demand side also there was all around the world panic buying and food hoarding that proliferated by the pandemic. Now, it's interesting because there is food prices. If we look at global indexes, still at similar prices that 3 months ago. However, what it changed significantly is the prices across countries. And unfortunately, and that's why I call this section COVID-19 food prices and Africa, because everything points that the countries that will suffer the most high prices of food will be the poorest countries in Africa. Well, first of all, in the poorest countries, food accounts for 40 to 60% of consumption basket in poor countries. COVID-19 set a radically exacerbate food insecurity in Africa. Lockdown measures have disrupted internal supply chain, which actually halt food production in Africa. Keep in mind that in poor countries, storage facilities and transport are not so good in general, and that's why they cannot actually storage properly and suffer much more than in developed nations. Then the locust swarm have also devastated crops in Eastern Africa, making the continent more dependent on food externally sourced. But at the same time that Africa needs more food, most countries that produce food are actually stop exporting, which makes things more complicated in Africa. And although global food prices remain stable, food shortages and prices in Africa are expected to surge in 2020. Now, one of the things that in the data start to appear, because generally this food data, inflation data on food is monthly, and in some poor countries is even available quarterly. But the issue there is that what we're going to see is that even when global prices of food remain stable, internal price of food in developing countries, in Africa in particular, will start to surge. Already we see that in China, that food prices increased 15% in the last few months. Okay, that's all what I have to say. Thank you very much, and I have here some references if you need it.
Thank you, Joachim. Our last presenter is Karina.
Okay, thank you, Renee. Can you hear me fine?
Yes, sorry, had to unmute myself.
That's okay, great. You can all see the screen?
Yes.
Excellent, okay, thank you. Thank you to Karma and also to Renee and Joachim for organizing this program, which is very exciting to be a part of. Today I'm going to talk about growth prospects for Australia looking beyond the current economic crisis, to help frame a discussion of longer-term growth beyond the current economic crisis, it's useful to decompose GDP per capita into what's commonly referred to as the 3 Ps. So we have here output per labour, and here we have the labour force participation. And our last term here is the population of dependents to the working age population. So if we look at the growth rate of per capita GDP over time, we'll get the 3 Ps: labour productivity growth, labour force participation growth, and growth in 1 plus the dependency ratio. Now, let's have a look at the first P. Now, as Jenny mentioned at the very beginning, productivity is particularly important. And if we take the logarithm of output per labour, we can identify 3 components. The first would be hourly labour productivity. The second would be average hours per worker. And the third component would be 1 minus the unemployment rate. The advantage of actually looking at the log levels, of course, is if you plot the logarithm of output per labour over time, you'll be able to distinguish level effects from long-run growth effects. So if you look at the slope of a plot of log of output per labour over time, the slope of that curve will, of course, give you the growth rate in productivity. And anything that shifts the curve down would be a fall in productivity level. So a decrease in the slope would mean a slower growth rate. So we talk a lot about flattening curves at the moment. This is one curve that you certainly don't want to see flatten. Looking in terms of where we've come from, the most important determinants of growth in output per labour are the growth rates in hourly labour productivity and growth in average hours per worker. And it's useful to just refer back to some of the points that Warwick made about the current economic crisis. The sort of base case is a doubling of the unemployment rate to 10%, and that would be a shift down in the curve. A contraction of hours worked by 20%. That's larger than the output decline, as most affected industries are labour intensive. And I'd like to come back to that in a moment with regards to female hours worked. Now, in terms of the third P, population ageing implies a growth in the dependency ratio relative to the working age population. And that's a demographic drag on growth. Nonetheless, that drag on growth can be more than offset by increases in productivity growth and increases in labour force participation growth. And in terms of where we've come from, we did see very strong growth in female labour force participation. So this is our second P. And indeed, that was a pattern that was evidenced across other countries as well. So looking at the sort of 4 decades, 1960 to 2000, that was attributed or associated with a decline in fertility, which increased female labour force participation by 18 percentage points. Most recently, in the last decade, female labour force participation has peaked. And we're seeing that of course, the growth rate in female labour force participation is slowing. Now, in terms of we've heard some talk from the previous panelists about some very important roles that behavioural responses play. Warwick made that point first. And also decisions that households make in response to to changes in their circumstances. In terms of female labour force participation, as female wages rise relative to male wages, there are competing effects on demand for children. On the one hand, higher wages make children more affordable. Children are nice things, and we have them, they're little people, which is always lovely. But at the same time, those higher wages imply that the cost of using unpaid time to rear children increases. And of course, this association between fertility decline and rising female labour force participation is something that is from the past. It's not something that we need to accept in the present. And that income effect may dominate the substitution effect, in which case, if you have things like affordable childcare and parental leave, which mitigates that rising childcare cost, there's no reason why you can't have reversal of fertility decline and rising female labour force participation, which we have seen over the last decade or so. But it's worth noting that coming into this current economic crisis, female labour force participation is growing at a slower rate. And some of the vulnerabilities which Anela pointed out in terms of those that might bear the cost more of COVID, more so than others during this current economic crisis. We know that women receive lower wages and spend less time in paid work than men. And that, of course, implies that there's a gender earnings gap. Now, in terms of household responses, that can impact on a couple's decision in terms of who stays home, if indeed they have that choice, because the lower opportunity cost of women's time at home. In terms of the demand side of things, we have a gender segregated workforce. And what we do know is that male-dominated industries are impacted less during lockdown. I actually just, if you have a look at this table, these are all the male-dominated industries, and they all happen to be in essential services. The other aspect of female labour force or female hours worked, as well as labour force participation, is that a short time out of activity has important implications for women's earnings. So the birth of the first child alone reduces women's earnings over their careers by 20% relative to their male counterparts. Now, the other P that we mentioned was population, of course. And Australia has had significant increases in net overseas migration, which accounted for most of the rise. You can see from this figure here, most of the rise in population over the past 15 years. And that has lessened the demographic drag on growth to some extent, because 88% of migrants are working age and under 40 years. Now, in the current economic crisis, of course, we have a situation where migration has been temporarily stopped. The other aspect of net overseas migration is that it contributes to population growth, and this also has had an impact on house prices, because the population growth in combination with the fact that elderly are remaining households for longer increases demand. If supply is not there to meet it, then you'll get rising house prices. So there's a sort of underpinning of the rising house prices that we've seen. As a result, households are carrying more debt for longer. So more than half of homeowners aged 55 to 64 hold a mortgage, and more than 1 in 3 are over indebted. So when we talk about labour market effects, and we talk about people who may be out of work longer term as a result of the economic crisis, the current economic crisis, then it's worth looking at the demographics of those changes in employment as well. Now, the other aspect of net overseas migration, which I think has attracted attention during this crisis and is certainly something to keep in mind moving forward, is if you think about our trade with China, it's often summarised as we export resources and we import manufactured goods, which is a fair enough description in terms of broad strokes. This figure shows that exports of education services have risen sharply, driven by demand from China. And indeed, in terms of Australia, education is a large sector in terms of wages. Wages account for 3/5 of revenue in higher education. That compares with 1/10 in mining. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you that post-GFC, our iron ore exports to China increased, and that aided us in our recovery. The question now, and in fact, Anella showed the data on infrastructure investment for China, and we saw a very nice V-shaped recovery. Something to think about moving forward is that is China's infrastructure stimulus in response to the current crisis going to be, full still ahead, which would benefit Australia, or are we looking for something more nuanced in terms of R&D? There are other things that were mentioned earlier in the presentation, such as Brazil's struggle with the virus, which of course puts Australia in a good position in terms of demand for iron ore exports. So I'm not saying that there's a problem there. It's certainly something to think about. In terms of productivity, it's interesting that Australia is heading into the current economic crisis with the lowest productivity growth in 4 decades. It's about 1% per annum. And therefore it's actually worth taking the time to talk about what drives productivity. I mean, we can think about it in terms of the traditional transitory growth, which comes from investment in physical capital, and post-GFC, a good example of that would have been China. Remembering Francesco's presentation in terms of Italy, obviously that wasn't an example of that. But it's worth actually moving beyond that to actually think about Australia as not being an innovator, but being a country which uptakes technology and innovation. And if one were to look at this crisis as an opportunity, then that's certainly a useful way of looking at things. So investment in skill, or the know-how to actually use technology that's encapsulated in intermediate goods, is something that Australia would benefit from investing in. And where does technology come from? Well, that's a useful way of looking at this is that there's a world technology frontier, and that R&D based growth drives that world technology frontier. So that's sort of coming from the world, and Australia's challenge is to ensure that they can import the technology and that they have the know-how to use that. So the challenges posed to Australia are ensuring a higher education sector, which we just looked at before in terms of the vulnerabilities of that, to deliver the increase in skill, and also Warwick referred to global supply chains and disruptions in that, which we would not want to see impact on delivery of that imported technology. In terms of conceptualizing R&D based growth coming from the world, The OECD accounts for most of the world's R&D. China is quite a strong player and becoming increasingly important in terms of R&D. Some of the earlier models of R&D-based growth, such as Jones's model, predicted that the rate of technological progress is proportional to population growth. Now that poses a bit of a problem because population growth is going to zero, which has brought to life a new field in R&D-based growth, which is to actually consider that R&D creates non-rivalrous ideas for new technology, and education accumulates embodied human capital, which is employed in that R&D. So the world technology grows from R&D, which might exhibit increasing returns to scale, and even if education exhibits decreasing returns to scale, these two aspects together are enough to sustain growth in technology. Now, I apologise for the maths here. I'm giving a bit of a quick summary of a sort of why there is scope to lift that 1% per annum productivity growth in Australia if we sort of look at the world technology frontier. In terms of the intuition behind the model, it would be quite simple, and that is that R&D draws on researchers' human capital, which in turn accumulates by drawing on ideas. And so you get ideas and aggregate human capital of researchers increasing together over time in a virtuous circle. Now, the upside of that is that you can raise the share of labour engaged in R&D and education, these two things, these two shares, by actually reducing the share used in final production. Now, that seems to be quite pertinent at the moment, given this talk of manufacturing, redirecting, the sort of made in our country rather than made overseas. So this concept of redirecting resources into manufacturing away from other sectors is a challenge for growth in the world technology frontier. And also the vaccine race. Coming back to Warwick's scenarios of scenario one's what we're hopefully facing. But in terms of moving forward, there's obviously a lot of focus on vaccines. And if that's redirecting research from other R&D, then of course we could see a negative impact on sustained growth in the world technology frontier. So I hope that's shed or hopefully prompted some debate or questions. And thank you for zooming in. If you're interested in any of these papers, there's a couple here that you could probably look at. Feel free to email me anytime. Thank you for zooming in, but please don't zoom out because I'm going to hand over back to Renee to take some questions.
Okay, thank you, Karina. I will just bring the other panelists up. We've actually answered most of the questions that we had, my participants, already during the session. So this little Q&A function is quite good. I think there's just one more question left. And maybe, Karina, you can be the one to answer that.
Oh, okay.
Does the government's comparative advantage in dealing with aggregate risk argue against self-funded superannuation? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Sorry, could you repeat that question? Comparative advantage in?
Dealing with aggregate risk argue against self-funded superannuation. I'm guessing this is for an Australian audience, given that we're talking about superannuation. So it's either you, Joachim, or Warwick who might be able to answer.
In terms of aggregate risk, is that that was what Anela was speaking about, right?
Okay, I'm guilty for raising the issue. I'll take a stab at
sorry.
it. So I think what we have to be careful what we're thinking of in terms of aggregate risk and what it does to superannuation. This is saving over a long period. Sure, I think the government balance sheet has a role to play for those who aren't in a position to save, for sure. But it does also, if it's for everybody, as we know, it creates issues with demographics and so on. So I'm not a superannuation specialist. I'd have to think about what aggregate risk we're thinking about, apart from people who can't afford it, to have some public savings, public pension, and I'm sure Australia has that.
Okay, thank you, Anella. And we just have one last question. I think we need to wrap up after this one. We're running a little bit over time. It's from Gordon McCormick. Given the significant effect on the unemployment of low-income workers, 40% of those on 40K or less, 40,000 or less being unemployed in the US, is there any consideration of the social impacts associated with an implicit move to the political right across the globe? Does anyone want to take that one up?
I think it'll be very interesting to see how politics evolves after this crisis, but that's anybody's guess.
Yep.
Okay then. We might wrap up there. So thank you for all of your questions. You can read the answers to those questions in the Q&A tab. And we've come to the end of our session. So it's been a pleasure to spend the last hour and a half with all of our panelists. But I'd like to thank Jenny Gordon, Warwick McKibben, Francesco Rezzavolo, Anella Monroe, Joaquin Vespignani, and Karina Day. And I especially would like to thank our attendees who are not necessarily in a convenient time zone for staying connected with us. So it's obviously very difficult in these times when we can't travel to visit each other. And also thank you to Rosanna Bastos Pinto for her help in organising the event that we have here. I'm just going to quickly advertise our next event. We have Ross Hammond from the Brookings Institution giving a talk on testing responses through agent-based epidemiology. So he does some fascinating research. So if you'd like to sign up for that seminar, then see the CAMA page. And this link here is where you will find all of the information on the activities of CAMA and of this particular program. So once again, thank you all to I guess we normally give a round of applause, but we can't hear each other. So, but we know that it's all happening there virtually. So we'll end it there. Good night.